Happy Thursday, kings and queens. We are jumping into another lesson. This is Math 7, Unit 2, Lesson 2a. And today is Thursday, November 12th. Our lesson is as follows. We're going to start talking about operation of rational numbers. And day one, we're changing temperatures. Our classroom norms, as usual, your cameras are to be on, your mics are muted unless you're speaking, of course, and you are ready to learn. You will need your Math 7 Spiral notebook to take notes in. You'll also need the student companion that can be found in Google Classroom. So let's jump right in. Our standard for today is 7.ns.1, and our objectives are that students will determine the final temperature given the starting temperature and the change in temperature, and explain the solution method. Also, you guys are going to explain how to create a number line diagram that represents adding signed numbers. And you're going to write an addition equation to represent a situation involving a temperature increase or decrease. Our mathematical practices for today are MP2, MP5, and MP8, which are reason abstractly and quantitatively, use the appropriate tools strategically, and look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning. As always, let's make sure that we're ready to take notes and work collaboratively. We'll pause the video here so that you guys can copy down your standard and objective, and then we'll move forward shortly. All right, let's move to our engagement activity. As you can see the blue icon in the right-hand corner, we know that this is also in your student companion. So at this time, let's make sure that we've opened our student companion so that we have access to making sure that we get a grade for today. So if I look here at the engagement activity, it says which pair of arrows doesn't belong? Is it letter choice A, B, C, or D? So which pair of arrows doesn't belong? Let's go ahead and put the answer in the chat and see what it is that you think. All right. So doing this activity might have seemed somewhat of a struggle because it's hard to determine which one doesn't belong. So, for this particular activity, there is no correct answer for it. So, for instance, you might have said A because this is the only one where both arrows point right, or you may have said B because this is the only one where the arrow point in opposite directions and are different lengths. Or you may have said C because those are the only ones where the arrows point in opposite directions and are the same length. Or you could have said D because it's the only one where both arrows point left. So your justification for all of these could have been different. So let's keep going. Let's think about what do you think the arrows might represent? So in this unit, we'll represent positive and negative numbers and their sums using arrows on a number line. So once again, we're going to represent positive and negative numbers and their sums, which is addition, using arrows on a number line. So let's look at our goals for today. Today, we want to be able to use a number line to add positive and negative numbers as our goal. So let's jump into our exploration activity, which also can be found in your student companion, and it is entitled Warmer and Colder. And we're going to begin working quietly in your student companion. So it says, if the temperature starts at 40 degrees and increases 10 degrees, what will the temperature be? And how does this diagram represent the situation? So you might notice that the diagram represents the situation because it includes the starting temperature. It goes from 0 to 40, which is my starting temperature. And then the change, which means that it increased by 10. So that's the change. So starting at 40, we increased it by 10. And then that gives us our final temperature. The point at this number line is represented by a table in your student companion. So we want to be able to look at your student companion and be able to answer these questions. So I'm going to give you guys some individual work time to complete numbers 1 and 2 in your student companion. It says complete the table and click on the number lines and select edit to create the diagram for each situation. So for part A, you're going to start at 40. It gets 10 degrees warmer, which means that you add 50. So your addition equation is 40 plus 10 equals 50. Again, I'm reading this directly from your student companion. So then you're going to click on the number line for A and then show your arrows by editing it. So we're going to give you about 4 minutes to do numbers 1 and number 2 for this problem. All right, so let's think about row B. How will we represent the situation on a number line? It says we're starting at 40 degrees and it gets 5 degrees colder. That means that my temperature is going to go down. So what will my addition equation look like, and how will we represent this on a number line? Well, it will be 40 plus -5, and we're going to have a reverse arrow go starting at 40 and then going to the left 5 units because we want to represent a final answer of 35 degrees. So let's take some quiet time once again to continue to finish and edit this activity in your student companion. You'll have about 4 minutes, and we want to make sure that you're ready to discuss your thinking with the whole class and revise your work as needed. So again, we'll stop here so that you guys can continue to work on the assignment, and we'll pick back up and share our reasoning with the class. All right. So now let's take some time to talk and chat with each other. You can either put the answers to this in the chat or you can go ahead and unmute yourselves as we ask the next set of questions. So the first one is, how can we represent an increase in temperature on a number line? So in the chat, put your answer to this question. How can we represent an increase in temperature on a number line? Or you can unmute yourself and answer this question. Okay, so the answer to this, we can represent an increase in temperature on a number line by using an arrow pointing to the right. So if we're increasing something, we're going to use an arrow pointing to the right. Let's do the same thing for the next one. How can we represent a decrease in temperature on a number line? So again, put it in the chat or you can unmute yourselves. We'll take 30 seconds for think time. How can we represent a decrease in temperature on a number line? So for a decrease in temperature, we're going to use an arrow pointing to the left. Okay? So let's think about this scenario. How are positive numbers represented on a number line? How are positive numbers represented on a number line? Once again, it's an arrow pointing to the right. So remember, think about the number lines that we drew for the last two situations and think about how every time we had a positive number or an increase, it was an arrow pointing to the right. Now, how are negative numbers represented on a number line? Once again, you can put it in the chat or unmute yourselves to answer the question. How are negative numbers represented on a number line? By arrows pointing to the left. So arrows pointing to the left. Okay, this one's a little bit different. How can we represent the sum of two numbers? We know that sum is translated into addition. So how can we represent the sum of two numbers? So let's take 30 seconds, think about this, and let's put your answers in the chat. How can we represent the sum of two numbers? And for this one, we're going to put the arrows so the tail of the second is at the tip of the first. So we want to make sure that in order to show the sum, we're going to use two arrows so that the tail of the second is at the tip of the first one. How can we determine the sum from the diagram? How can we determine the sum from the diagram? Well, for this one, it is at the tip of the second arrow. So we can determine the sum of the diagram by looking at the tip of the second arrow. So wherever the second arrow is finished pointing at, that will tell us the sum from a diagram. Next, we have what happens when we add a positive number to another number. What happens when we add a positive number to another number? Let's put your answers in the chat once again. What happens when a positive number is added to another number? We move to the right on the number line. So whenever we add a positive number to another number, we're moving to the right on the number line. And our last question says, what happens when we add a negative number to another number? What happens when we add a negative number to another number? Well, for this scenario, we know that we move to the left on the number line. We move to the left on the number line. Okay, so let's go to our next activity, and we're going to start talking about winter temperatures. This can also be found in your student companion. And let's look at this. It says these are the locations you'll be looking at in this activity. So we look at Utah, I believe that says Minnesota, Texas, and Florida. And it says in the northern hemisphere, it tends to be colder the further north you are located. So the first question says in Orlando, it's 10 degrees warmer than it is in Houston. And we know the opening sentence in the student companion says, one winter day, the temperature in Houston is 8 degrees Celsius. And we want to find the temperatures in these other cities and explain or show your reasoning. So again, on one winter day, it's 8 degrees in Houston. And it says in Orlando, it is 10 degrees warmer than it is in Houston. So in the chat, if we're starting at 8 degrees in Houston and it's getting 10 degrees warmer, what is my final temperature going to be? Let's go ahead and put that in the chat now. If I'm starting at 8 degrees in Houston and it's 10 degrees warmer in Orlando, what's the final temperature change that I'm going to capture? And I'm going to put that in the chat. Hopefully, you realize that the answer is 8. Orlando is 18 degrees Celsius. So, again, I'm starting on my number line with my initial being 8, and then I'm adding 10. So that takes me to 18 because 8 plus 10 is equal to 18. Okay, let's look at our next example. Our next example says in Salt Lake City, it is 8 degrees colder than it is in Houston. It is 8 degrees colder than it is in Houston. So once again, Houston is starting at 8 degrees because we read that in our student companion. But in Salt Lake City, it's 8 degrees colder. So what would my final answer be for this scenario? Let's put that in the chat. and then we'll show you what it looks like on the number line. So hopefully you realize that the final answer is going to be, if I'm starting at 8 degrees in Houston, but Salt Lake City is 8 degrees colder, it just takes me back to my starting point at 0. Remember, wherever the tip of my second arrow is, that's my answer. So your final answer was 0 because 8 degrees and adding -8 for getting 8 degrees colder is equal to 0. So 8 plus a -8 equals 0. So let's make sure that we have this captured in our student companion. So the next one says in Minneapolis, it is 20 degrees colder than it is in Houston. So we're starting at 8, but we know that it's 20 degrees colder than it is in Houston. So remember, I must start at the tip of my first arrow to get my second arrow. So let's think about what would the answer be for this problem. So let's remember that the initial temperature of 8 is represented by an arrow starting at 0 going to 8 on the number line. Because this says it is 20 degrees colder, there's a decrease in temperature, which means that we're going to draw an arrow starting at the tip of my first arrow going 20 units to the left to give us a final answer that falls at -12. So 8 plus -20 is equal to -12, and you can count that on a number line. So your answer for this problem should have been -12. And last but not least, for our examples, it says in Fairbanks, it is 10 degrees colder than it is in Minneapolis. So remember, Minneapolis was at -12. That's what we just figured out. So, what is the temperature in Fairbanks? So, I'll give you a start. Remember, Minneapolis was at -12. And in Fairbanks, it's 10 degrees colder, meaning the temperature is going down. So, what is my answer going to be for this situation? So, I'm going to take this arrow and go another 10 degrees, and it takes us to -22 degrees because -12 plus -10 is equal to -22. So, -22 degrees Celsius was my answer for this problem. Okay. Also, let's make sure we'll pause here for 1 minute so that you can answer the last question, number 5, where it says write an additional equation that represents the relationship between the temperature in Houston and the temperature in Fairbanks. So let's take 1 minute to answer that question. All right, let's keep going. So, just as a lesson synthesis, we want to talk about the different things that we've kind of gone over. So, the first one is how can you represent a decrease in temperature using an addition equation? Well, we can represent a decrease as adding a negative number. So, when we want to show how to represent this, you can represent it by adding a negative number. Also, how can you represent an addition equation on a number line? Well, we can represent this on a number line with two arrows, the second arrow starting where the first arrow ends. And last but not least, how can you represent a decrease in an equation on a number line? Well, we can do this by representing a negative and then on a number line as an arrow pointing to the left. So here is our word wall for today. We have our arrows modeling addition on a number line. And we're also going to give you time to do your evaluation activity. So we're going to pause the video here we're going to give you 4 minutes to answer the questions about stories about temperature. There are 2 questions, and you're completing this in your student companion. So at this time, we'll pause the video here for 4 minutes so that you guys can answer number 1 and number 2, and then submit your student companion in Google Classroom. All right, thank you guys so much for answering those 2 questions in your student companion on your own, and then also submitting it in Google Classroom. So let's go over what our goals were for today. We wanted to be able to represent a decrease as adding a negative number. We also wanted to represent addition on a number line with 2 arrows, the second arrow starting where the first one ends. And then we wanted to be able to represent adding a negative number on a line as an arrow is pointing to the left. So those were our goals for today. So we've accomplished all of our goals. Today, you do not have an independent activity. However, I will ask that you guys go back and make sure that you've submitted all of the activities for this week. If you have not, today is the only day that you will have to make them up. It is second quarter now, so we won't have the opportunity to continue to make up work. So let's make sure that if you have not submitted anything from this week, that today at this point, you use your time wisely to go back and submit anything. Please also make sure that you have submitted your student companion for today. Otherwise, you do not have any new independent activities. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. And we will see you back tomorrow on Friday for another lesson. And then we will go from there. Thank you guys and have a great rest of your day.